Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Blake here from chesspathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Maroczy Bind. The Maroczy Bind is more of a pawn structure than an opening, but it's most often associated with the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. So let's go ahead and take a look. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, takes, and g6. This is the accelerated dragon. Black wants to put this bishop on g7 without committing this move d6 or knight f6 yet. But one disadvantage of this move order, or at least you could argue it's a disadvantage, is that black hasn't forced white to play knight c3 yet to defend their e4 pawn. And this gives white the additional option to play pawn to c4, and now we're in the Maroczy Bind. So what's the purpose of this move c4? White just wants to play a positional game and kind of squeeze black to death by stopping all of their pawn breaks. We know white has a space advantage here, and c4 is going to make it a lot harder for black to play d5 or for black to play b5. And if they can't play one of those moves, what's black going to do here? They probably don't want to play e5, not if this bishop's still on the board. That would make this bishop a very bad piece here on g7 and could make this d6 square a weakness. For example, here, let's say there's some normal developing moves. This is all pretty normal. Castle, bishop e2. If black were to play here e5 or even just e6, if they touch this e-pawn too early, white could simply play knight b5, and now this d6 square is a big weakness. So coming back to this starting position, we understand white's point now. It's going to be hard for black to play b5, d5, e5, and white just wants to, expand on their space advantage and get a good position. White can sometimes play on the queen side with b4. White can sometimes play on the king side with f4. Sometimes white just plays b3 and f3 and totally stabilizes their center and kind of dares black to do something, as white just slowly improves their position. Because of this, for a long time, the accelerated dragon was considered to be not such a great opening to play with black because the Maroczy Bind was considered almost a refutation of this opening. But in more recent years, players with black have figured out that you can play these kinds of positions and black has ways to get counterplay. So let's go ahead and take a look at how the game might develop. So, okay, pawn to c4, bishop g7, bishop e3 defending the knight, knight f6, knight c3 defending the pawn, castles, bishop e2, and d6. These are all pretty normal moves. Black has to open up this bishop into the game. We know that moving the e-pawn can be dangerous, so d6 has to be played sooner or later. And now let's take a look at one of the main lines here to get an understanding for how these positions can go. So white goes ahead and gets castled. Black plays bishop d7, developing that bishop. They might want to put it on c6 at some point, where it can start eyeing this pawn here in the center. White plays queen d2 and develops the queen. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop c6. That was black's intention to bring that bishop to the c6 square. Now this e4 pawn is under attack, so white can defend it with pawn to f3. And now black plays a5. This move has become the main line of the accelerated dragon, and the idea is pretty simple. Black just wants to play knight d7 and knight c5, and put this knight on a nice outpost here, where it can't really be harassed too easily by the white pawns, because black's preventing pawn to b4. For the time being, white's prevented from expanding on the queen side, and white's also kind of prevented from expanding on the king side because playing f4 too early would of course hang the e4 pawn. So let's see how white can react. White most commonly plays here b3. If white doesn't play b3, black might have the idea to advance with a4 at some point, so this just stops a4. I mean, black can play it, but now a4 can be met with b4. And white starts their expansion, and of course now there's no more en passant. So that's why b3 is often played. So knight d7. And now, white more often than not avoids the exchange of these bishops. It's actually kind of a goal for black now to exchange these bishops, which probably comes as a surprise to you if you haven't seen this kind of position before, because very often in the Sicilian dragon, we think about all those positions where white tries to exchange off this bishop, usually with bishop h6, and then the dark squares are weak around the king, and white plays h4, h5, and, sack, mate, as Bobby Fischer said. But that's not the kind of position we're playing here. White really isn't going to play h4, h5 after they castle kingside and play c4 in the center, right? Furthermore, playing c4 kind of weakens the dark squares for white in the center if these dark bishops come off the board. So by exchanging dark bishops, black's hoping they could achieve their dream endgame at some point, and I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like. Black's hoping to get a position that looks very much like this. This is what would happen after the dark bishops come off the board. Then black can route a knight into this d4 outpost. Black can finally play e5 because it doesn't really blunt the bishop anymore. And white would be in trouble here. This position's definitely better for black. This bishop's a bad bishop. This knight's very strong here on d4 and can't be dislodged. So this is one of black's objectives in the accelerated dragon. They can sometimes go for an endgame like this. Sometimes they do succeed in getting in one of their pawn breaks like b5 or d5 or even f5 in some cases. But if they can't get in a pawn break, they're really hoping for some position like this where they can exploit the d4 outpost that white created when they played pawn to c4. So coming back, after knight d7, white can play bishop back to e3 and just keep that bishop on the board for the time being. Now comes knight c5, white plays rook a to b1, just getting this rook out of the bishop's way here, so there's no tactics. And now queen b6. This is an interesting move here by black. The point is, well, there's 2 points to this move. One is to stop white from playing a3 and b4 right away, because if white played a3 now, black can actually take on b3. And even though black's queen is hanging, so is white's, and black's coming out ahead there. So this move stops a3 for the time being, and it also connects rooks. Black knows this queen can't stay here for too long, because it's walking right into this bishop, of course, but black just wants time to bring this rook to the queen side, and then this queen can drop back. So one of the main lines here continues rook f to c1, rook f to c8, and now rook c2. White's just preparing this advance with a3 and b4 to drive this knight away and start that queenside expansion. The point is now after a3, black can't take on b3, right? Because white would take the queen, black would take the queen, but now white wins the knight in the end. So, okay, it's time for that queen to get out of the pin. Black often plays queen to d8. White can play here bishop back to f1. White's not really in a rush here. White's just slowly improving their pieces, clearing this e2 square for the knight, because white might want to play knight e2 to d4 at some point. So here black can play h5, and this is an interesting idea. Think about what black's trying to do here if you want. You can go ahead and pause your video. Don't cheat and look over to the right. Keep your eyes on the board, but think about what black's trying to do here. Okay, if you're back with me, black's idea is often to play king h7 and queen f8 just so they can play bishop h6 and exchange bishops. We talked about how exchanging those dark bishops could be a goal for black. It's pretty impressive the lengths they're willing to go to exchange those dark bishops. But again, this is a slow, maneuvering kind of position, so it should make sense black's willing to invest all these tempos to achieve a good strategic goal. White could play here a3, starting their queenside expansion, king h7, b4. White's starting to push that knight away. Takes, knight a4. White can play knight e2 and keep knights on the board. Again, when you have a space advantage, you very often want to keep pieces on the board because that's how black is going to feel the cramp of their position, with their pieces kind of stumbling all over each other because they have less space. If you just exchange all the pieces off, then, black's probably not too concerned. So, queen f8, knight d4, bishop h6. Both sides are kind of getting parts of what they want. White's starting to expand on the queen side, and black has finally succeeded in trading off this dark bishop. So, there's a good sample line for understanding the fundamentals of the Maroczy Bind. I'm going to show you a few more examples of how the game can go in this particular line in the Accelerated Dragon 2. For example, one of them, let's say after e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, we're going to get our starting position here after c4, bishop g7, bishop e3, this is all kind of the main line here. I found one sample game here where black played, d6 castles, and instead of bishop d7, they just played rook e8, which to me doesn't make too much sense. I can't really understand the purpose behind rook e8, but I wanted to show this game because it illustrates another idea white has in the Maroczy Bind. We've talked about expanding on the queen side, we talked about expanding on the king side. Sometimes white wants to play a well-timed knight d5 and change the pawn structure favorably. So that's what happened in this game. Let's take a look. Queen d2, bishop d7, f3, a6, rook f to d1, rook c8, rook a to c1, takes, queen a5. All pretty normal moves. Black still isn't too close to getting one of their breaks in. Black could think about playing b5, but white makes it hard for black to do that. White plays a3, threatening to play b4 right away and start expanding, possibly. I know that a pawn would be hanging, but it's often dangerous to take that pawn. The queen could get trapped if you're not careful. So the game continued bishop e6, b4, queen h5, and now black succeeded in putting c4 under quite a bit of pressure here, but white simply played knight d5 and changed the pawn structure. Very often white can do this, and black almost always has to take if white plays knight d5, otherwise the knight's just too strong. And in this game, after bishop takes and e takes, now white has potential pressure down the road on this backwards e7 pawn. That's one of the points of this knight d5 idea. And secondly, this queen is kind of cut off from the rest of the action now and could even be harassed after moves like f4. So that's another idea to keep in mind in the Maroczy Bind. I'm going to show you a couple more sample lines. One idea white sometimes plays is they don't allow black to play this early knight takes d4 exchange that we've seen in the past couple games. So how this might look is after castles, bishop d7. We know that bishop d7 is played to prepare knight takes d4 and bishop c6. So white sometimes just plays knight back to c2, which looks a little bit passive. But the point is that it also kind of keeps this bishop passive now that it can't really arrive on c6. And again, we see the black pieces kind of stumbling over each other, wanting some of the same squares here, which often happens when the opponent has a space advantage. So let's see how this might go. I just pulled one sample line. Let's say rook c8, pawn to f3, a6, queen d2, knight e5. Black's trying to put some pressure here on the c4 pawn. We've seen that idea before. But here white can play knight a3 and defend that pawn. Bishop e6, adding to the pressure. And finally white plays knight d5 and changes the pawn structure. This idea comes up again. So takes. In this line, white often takes with the c-pawn, which has a different idea than taking with the e-pawn. If you take with the e-pawn, very often your plan is to target the backwards e-pawn at some point on this open e-file now. Taking with the c-pawn is often played when you have the bishop pair. These bishops are very well positioned to kind of exploit the queen side, especially in an endgame. So even though the structure is symmetrical here in terms of what files the pawns are on, white could hope that they can get an advantage over here on the queen side, especially later on in the game, using that strong bishop pair, and of course the d5 pawn giving them a space advantage in that sector. In one game I found black chose to break with e6 in this structure, which, okay, you can do that. That just changes the pawn structure again now, though, and now d6 could be a target on the open file. White could try to play, moves like rook d1, and you just get this structure. That's the nice thing about chess, right? The structure can change, and you have to adapt. A lot of people think of the Maroczy Bind as a very rigid pawn structure, where the pawn structure kind of defines the whole course of the game, which it can to some extent, but you also have to understand how the structure can change and how you have to adapt to that. Here's another example of how black can get creative in this pawn structure and try to fight for an advantage. So e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, takes, g6, c4, bishop g7. We've seen all this before. Bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, and here black sometimes plays knight to g4, which, it looks like the knight is loose here, but if white takes that knight, then this knight's hanging as well. So black can get away with this. So, okay, queen takes g4, knight takes d4, the queen comes back to d1 to defend c2, and now knight to e6, which looks very strange, right, if you haven't seen this before, but one of black's ideas is to play g5 at some point, often coupled with h5, and actually start pushing these kingside pawns. One example of how this could go is rook c1, queen a5, queen d2. White's kind of trying to prevent the doubled pawns here after bishop takes c3, which is very double-edged. It is dangerous to give up this bishop. But also black could consider doing it if it doubles the pawn. So white just avoids that by reinforcing this knight twice. But now comes b6, trying to get this bishop into the game to pressure this e4 pawn. Bishop e2, white wants to finish up their kingside development. Bishop b7, and white does have to worry about this pawn. There's some remove the defender ideas they have to watch out for, where this pawn would be loose. So white could play here f3, but this is the perfect opportunity for black to play g5. White has kind of made a target here to go after on f3 later on. With, h5 and g4 in some lines. White's kind of committed to castling short. There's no way white can really keep this king in the center forever. They certainly can't castle queenside. So black's using this opportunity to play this move g5, defended by the queen, defended by the knight. And after, for example, castles, h5, rook fd1, black finally plays d6 to defend this d7 pawn. And we get a very interesting double-edged position. One final note before we wrap up. You can see this Maroczy Bind pawn structure from other forms of the Sicilian besides the accelerated dragon. It's just usually called something else. For example, let's consider this Sicilian. So e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, takes, a6, bishop d3. This is a line in the Khan variation of the Sicilian. And white can sometimes play c4 here, and you get the same pawn structure, just without this pawn on g6. For example, queen c7, queen e2, d6, c4. A lot of the same ideas apply. Black often wants to play, b5 or d5 or f5 way down the line to try to break this pawn structure, whereas white's going to implement a lot of the same ideas and claim they have kind of this bind on the position. This position's often called the hedgehog, though, instead of the Maroczy Bind. The only real difference is this pawn's not on g6, black isn't fianchettoing, and that does have some significant strategic implications, of course, on the position. For example, of course, black can get away with this d6 pawn not being defended by the pawn on e7, because this bishop can watch over it. So d6 isn't as big of a concern here. Sometimes the bishop even swings around this way to get active. Eventually black's trying to prepare this d5 advance. So good to know that this hedgehog structure exists. Same kind of pawn structure, just some different ideas there in the middle game. Alright, I hope you learned a lot about the Maroczy Bind today. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up there. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds, and I'll send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. It took me way too long to become a chess master, and I want to help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I'll see you there.